Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Lynn and this video is a paper crafting 101 series, and today I will be focusing on paper. In my 101 series, what my goal is to give you a good overview of a particular topic and really just deep dive into all of the specifics that I happen to know. I'm always eager to learn more, so please do share in the comments if there's anything that I left out, and do feel free to correct me if I get anything wrong as well. In today's episode, what I'll talk about is paper, and more specifically, the different things that I will go over in terms of characteristics of paper are paper weight and the various different types of paper you can get, and as well paper grain and why that's important. And so starting off with paper weight, there's a lot of different ways that paper is weighed in a sense of actually trying to give you an idea for how thick or how thin any particular sheet of paper is. There's a lot of different methods for this, but the two prevailing measurement systems that you're probably most familiar with are the metric system. So that's usually seen as GSM, or grams per square meter, and the US based system, which is usually indicated by a number of pounds. And what's more confusing is that often in the US system, there's things that are referred to as cover weight versus index weight versus text weight, and those are all, even though they're all measured in pounds, they're all going to be slightly different. So what I am going to focus on is the two systems that I see most common for things like papers that paper crafters would normally use or album makers would normally use, and would normally be how cardstocks more specifically is measured. And so that will be the US basis weight that's annotated in cover weight, and the metric weight that's annotated in GSM. So I've got a variety of papers here, and I'll go into some of the differences, but let's first talk about paper weight. So paper weight is often a measure, as I mentioned, of how thick or how thin a sheet of cardstock is. So these are all white cardstocks, and if I just hold them up and wave them around, you can probably see how differently this one moves versus this one. So you can see this is very bendy, and you can hear it makes a different sound than this one, which is less bendy. It just sways, but it doesn't curl as it sways. And so that's just a rough way to kind of tell like how thick something is. The other thing you can do is just kind of flick it like that, and that gives you, again, a different sound and a different feel when you are flicking that. So that's a 120-pound cover. This is 80-pound. So you can see it sounds different. It feels very different in the hand. And you may use different weight papers for different purposes. So I've got 120-pound I really like for card bases, 80-pound and under, 65, 80-pound. I've also seen 72-pound. I like to use these as maybe mini album pages. When I'm covering a mini album cover, I like to use the thinner papers for that. And then 100-pound cover weight, it's a nice in-between of the two, which could work as a card base, depending on how much I layer on top of it, depending on whether there's like a pop-up mechanism or something interactive that I need like a nice sturdy base or not. So there may be a variety of different reasons that you might want one weight of cardstock over another. Now, what's the difference between the US system versus the metric system? I'll explain the metric system because it's so much easier and more straightforward. GSM stands for grams per square meter. Basically, paper manufacturers will cut one sheet of their paper and they will cut that to a size of 1 meter by 1 meter. So you get a square meter sheet of paper, and then they'll weigh that. And the number that you get in grams is the weight of that paper. It's as easy as that. So they cut a sheet of paper to 1 meter square, and then they weigh that to get the number of grams. That's grams per square meter. That's the metric system. The US system is different. The US system, paper manufacturers will take 500 sheets of paper, whatever size they happen to manufacture those sheets at, and then they weigh that in pounds. So let's say one manufacturer, usually the size is, I think, 17 by 22 before they start to cut it down into other various sizes. But let's say that one paper manufacturer happens to produce sheets in 8.5 by 11, and then they'll cut it down further from there. And let's say another manufacturer cuts their papers at 8.5 by 8.5. I'm just making up for instance. Well, if I took 500 sheets of 8.5 by 8.5, that's of course going to weigh less than 500 sheets of 8.5 by 11, even if they are the same thickness. Just because this is a different size of paper, if I stack 500 sheets of that, it's going to, of course, weigh less than this. If I took this sheet and cut it down to 8.5, the same size as this, then it will weigh the same. But all of that depends on the paper manufacturer and the size sheet that they manufacture. And because it's not standard across all manufacturers what size sheets they need to produce, that's why sometimes you have this effect of, from one brand, you might buy paper and it says it's 80 pound, and then you buy paper somewhere else that also says it's 80 pound cover weight, but the two don't feel the same. Well, there's a chance that they're producing papers at different sizes, and when they go to weigh 500 sheets of whatever size they're weighing, it ends up being different, even though those papers are the exact same thickness. So that's why the system of pounds can be a little bit harder to get a very consistent idea for how thick or thin a piece of cardstock actually is. Where GSM, it's very specific, and it's also the same across all manufacturers. They all cut their paper to 1 square meter, and then they weigh that sheet of paper. So the only difference is going to be how thick or how thin that paper is, and that's going to be directly reflected in the weight. So that's a little bit of how paper weight is measured, and there are conversion charts out there that you can get that will translate these different weights for you. So here's one, and I have all of this information in a blog post as well, so if you want, you can leave a link to that blog post in the description box below, so you can get this chart. But it's just one that I found online, and it kind of tells you all all of the different types of measuring systems, because you have cover weight, you have text weight, you have index, you have points, you have various different things. This last column is GSM, and cover weight is here. So those are the two that I see most often in cardstocks that I buy for paper crafting. The ones I've highlighted here are ones that I most commonly use. So as I mentioned, 65, 80 pound, I typically use those for maybe layering weight. If I'm working on like die cut layers, and it's going to have a lot of layers, or a card sketch that has a lot of layers, I do like to keep 65 pound, usually color cardstock, for that, so that I can layer up multiple layers and it doesn't make the card too heavy to ship. Then same with 80 pound, it's just a nice kind of layering weight. I'll use this for maybe mini album pages, 65 to cover my mini album covers, and then 120 and 100, I use those for card bases, 120 especially for card bases that have maybe a pop-up mechanism or an interactive component to it, because then it's nice and sturdy. Sometimes you do need something a little bit thinner if it's a fun fold, so that you can fold it really nicely without it cracking. And as well, if it's something that's going to be folded a lot, then sometimes it's nicer to maybe work with 80 pound. So it just depends on the project and the style of the project, what weight paper I go with. But those are the ones that are most common in my craft room, and what I use them for. So then in terms of the different types of paper, I had on screen a moment ago a lot of different papers on here, and I'm not going to go through every single type of paper that you can get. There's a lot out there. I'm just going to go over maybe some of the more common ones that you might see. And in terms of describing the paper type, I think there's a lot of different ways that you can look at paper and a lot of different characteristics. So the first is probably one of the more obvious, and that is color. So papers can come in a variety of different colors. You can see a sample of what I have here. And so one of the things with color is that there's actually a couple different ways that color is reflected or added to paper. One of those ways is that it is just printed onto the paper. And so you can get lovely, this is just scrap, so you can get lovely pattern papers like this. So it's a nice printed paper. Usually with printed papers, you could have a pattern, or it could be printed solid color like this. In the manufacturing process of a printed paper, the paper is created, manufactured as white, and then it's printed on. So it can be printed on sometimes on both sides, like this solid color paper is. Sometimes with pattern papers, it's printed on both sides, and sometimes it's only printed on one side. But with printed papers, one of the common characteristics is that the inside is going to be white, because it was originally a white sheet of paper that's been printed on. So that does give you the option to do things like this, where when you tear it, you can expose that white core. So it's called white core paper. And a lot of times with solid color cardstock, some people prefer a white core solid color cardstock, and some people prefer solid core. So for example here, if I tore this, you can see it's the same color through and through. It's not white on the inside. The way this paper was made is that the individual pulp fibers, the wood fibers that created this sheet of paper, those were all dyed together, and then it was processed together and it formed this sheet of paper. Whereas with this paper, it was originally white and then it's just been printed so that it has a color on it. Or in some cases, like pattern paper, it would have a color on it. And so that's why it's white on the inside. So that's the color of paper. Next, there are papers that have like a different texture to them. So you've got your smooth papers, virtually no texture to that at all. You have some that have maybe a little bit of a like a linen texture to it, and so this has a different look to it, has a different feel to it, and as well, that might have some impact on how you work with that, because maybe this is harder to ink on top of when you're stamping a sentiment, let's say, but maybe that texture is good for ink blending because there's a lot of rough surface to kind of grab. Maybe it's good for a medium like colored pencils for that same reason. And but that might make it harder for things like alcohol marker coloring, which generally prefers a smoother surface. Even among just your plain old white cardstock, there's a lot of I wouldn't say a lot, but there's differences in smoothness and roughness. And of course, that doesn't even get into things like watercolor paper or color pencil paper, which is created to actually have some tooth to it, to have a little bit of some people even color onto sandpaper because it's got just that little bit of grit that will grab onto the wax of a colored pencil, making it a little bit more suited for that medium. And then you've got your like super smooth papers, like the 100-pound hammer mill that I like to use a lot of, and that's great for alcohol marker coloring. It's good for glimmering or foiling onto. So paper texture can come in a lot of different different looks as well. Those are just kind of the textures that you might see as a bit of a standard, but then you've got others that are a lot more ornate. So here's like an embossed specialty paper that actually has an embossed design to it, and you've got that that texture built into it intentionally. But and then here yet still is an cotton paper, again another specialty paper with again a texture that's part of that. So these are textures that are kind of embossed into the papers so that you get that lovely pattern and the nice texture to it as well. So those are different textures that you could get as part of the design of the paper. Then as well, there's another characteristic that you might be very familiar with is the finish of a paper. So for example, you could get a lot of papers, especially papers like a glitter cardstock. So here are a couple. Usually, these also you could actually consider as a texture too, but these just have a very different finish to them. Often there's a coating of sorts that helps to encapsulate that glitter so that it doesn't shed, it doesn't flake off. So those might have their own kind of look to them. Then there's a good variety of other specialty cardstocks, like you could have some very glossy, high shine mirror cards. So like you can see how reflective this one. You can see my camera there. So mirror cards are really great. This is a regular mirror card, and I don't know the exact color name. These are iridescent mirror cards, so you can see as it's reflecting, you can see the rainbow. So that's sort of that iridescent effect, that sort of aurora borealis effect almost. And so even though it's got a base color to it, just depending on how you tilt it, you can definitely see different colors come through. So those are your more high gloss finishes. Then we have some that are mirror, but they are a little bit more subtle, so a little bit more satin in their finish. So here are, especially, so you can see these three have it's reflective still, and it's shiny, but it's not quite as high gloss, so it's got a bit more of a matte feel to it. And then stepping down further, you have this, which is pearlescent, and it just has a really lovely shimmer, but it's not reflective, it's not high gloss. It's just got some really lovely shimmer to it, so a little bit more subtle. So lots of different varieties there in terms of the finish. And if you're looking at, and this doesn't even go into pattern papers, which of course you can get a huge variety of pattern papers as well, and those can have a more matte finish as well as a more glossy finish. And that finish, whether something is glossy or matte, it can impact how well other media reacts to it. So something that's very high gloss, for example, you might not be able to maybe ink the edges if you wanted to really kind of give it that distressed look, or have a little bit of vignetting on that, where a matte cardstock could, or pattern paper, might take to ink a little bit better, because if anything is glossy, it's likely getting that gloss from some sort of coating. And so if it has a sort of coating, that coating is going to prevent any sort of medium from seeping into your cardstock. And so that also impacts maybe the type of glues or adhesives that you use as well, because something that's very glossy, that has or for example glitter that has a coating that encapsulates the glitter, you might find different adhesives work better for that versus a cardstock, where the adhesive can just start to soak into the paper fibers and start to bond right away. So the different finishes of your papers can actually have an impact on how you use that paper and the look that you get from it. Then that doesn't even cover other papers that are called paper, but they're not really like a wood pulp product. So for example, Yupo paper isn't actually made of paper. Vellum as well, not really paper as such. The Spellbinders Glimmer paper, also those are all sort of plastic materials that are in the format of paper, but they're not in the traditional sense of how these papers are actually created from wood pulp, an actual wood product. So there's definitely like a lot more out there that would be considered paper. I'm just not covering all of those here, and I haven't even shown things like watercolor paper, color pencil paper. There's even specialty paper for pastels. There's a lot of different papers out there, but hopefully this just gives you a way of looking at the different characteristics of paper. So the color of the paper, the texture of the paper, and the finish of the paper, whether it has a coating, whether it has a reflective shine, all of that stuff. So those are the various different types of paper. And then I wanted to talk about the grain of paper. So paper grain, and this topic I'm leaving to the end because it may not be as important to you, just depending on the type of crafting that you do and whether or not you really need to take these things into consideration. But I did want to cover it. So the grain of a piece of paper essentially gives you an idea for how to use that paper and how to maintain its strength. So, for example, generally speaking, it's easier to bend a piece of paper if you bend it along its grain. So if I take this and I kind of bend it like that, and then I bend it this way, and I've made this square so that I don't know what is what, but this bends a lot more easily in this direction than this. There's more resistance in this direction. So that tells me that the grain is going that way. And I drew an arrow, so yeah. So that is that will tell you how the grain is oriented. And I drew an arrow to show which way the up was. If my paper was like this, if it's 8.5 by 11, that's 8.5 by 11 this way. So this was originally before I cut it down square. I drew a pencil mark to show that this was the long way. Well, the grain of this paper happens to go this way. So that's the grain. And when the grain of your paper is following the short edge, it's called short grain. And when the grain of your paper follows the long edge, it's called long grain. And so, each paper manufacturer is going to do theirs a little bit differently. And for thicker cardstocks like this one, it's actually quite hard to tell. Like I'm bending this and it's feeling a little bit the same in both directions. This one is 65 pounds, so a lot easier to tell. This one, this feels like it's long grain. But let me show you a way that you can tell for sure. So we know this orange is short grain. And there's a couple of different ways you can identify the grain of a paper if you were having a hard time telling. So just take a little swatch or a little bit of your paper. You don't need it to be that big. And then just spritz it with water on one side. It's going to naturally curl, and it's going to curl in the direction of the grain. So as it curls, see how it's curled like that, and that's our arrow. So the arrow, remember, pointed to the up direction. So basically, if I were just holding this as a sheet of paper that's 8.5 by 11, this points, up if I were to hold it like in its portrait orientation. So you can see the grain then is along that short edge. So that's how you can tell. One way to tell. If it's hard to just bend the paper, see how my arrow's pointing up, right? It's a little harder to bend it that way along the length, easier to bend it this way. And so why does that matter? And what's a different way to maybe visualize the grain of paper? So let's first address the first in terms of another way to visualize this. So let's say I have a bunch of different I've got a bunch of different pens here. And let's say that my pens are let's say these are the wood pulp of of paper. Well, there's going to be, pulp that is longer and than in one direction, and they're going to just naturally kind of line themselves up through the paper processing. And so they're gonna stack this way. They're gonna stack end to end like this, and then they're gonna stack edge to edge like this. So when we're talking about the grain is basically the direction that the long, paper fibers, the direction that they're flowing in. So that's the grain of the paper. So now if you think about what's more natural, if this is like a super zoomed up paper fibers, what's going to be more natural in terms of bending and folding? Well, you have longer gaps here, so it's going to bend and fold more easily going with the grain. So for example, we were saying that's a little bit tough. This is easy. So if my grain is like this, it's so much easier to bend and fold this because I can bend along inside these gaps really easily. But if I were to bend like this, it's a little bit harder because then I actually have to maybe bend something that's gonna bend in the middle of a paper fiber. So that's why, if I bend it along this edge, I can more cleanly kind of get in between, these long grains, or like along the grain, I should say, versus if I tried to bend this way, it's harder to find a place where they all line up. See how like these don't all line up end to end here. So when I bend something, if I bent it here, you're going to get some of this. Maybe it'll bend, but maybe it'll just crack as opposed to bending exactly where I want it to be. So that's sort of why the paper grain really matters, because if you've ever folded a piece of paper and you saw some cracking, it was paper fibers that are like, kind of just bending and cracking out instead of being a nice smooth fold where maybe you've scored and it's easier to kind of push this off a little bit to one side, off to that a little side, and then you get a nice fold here. So that's sort of the way that I visualize paper, the grain of paper and paper fibers, and how paper is created to hopefully have it make a little bit more sense in terms of, why paper reacts the way that it does. And so hopefully those tips help you to actually identify which the grain of the paper that you're working with, which direction it's going in. And so there's a couple different methods. I'll just recap how to find the grain of your paper. Just a few things actually. You could hold it by one edge, and if it stands out and is kind of stiff, then that is likely to be against the grain, because you're kind of holding it, at the tip here, and it's standing out like that. If you hold it on an edge and it flops, it's kind of bendy, and it flops down or curves down, then that's kind of tells you which way the grain is going. And because it's as it curves easily like that, that's the direction of the grain. That's going with the grain right there. And then you can, of course, bend it. You know, one way it might bend a little bit more easily than the other. And I showed you the water test, so you can just spritz one side with water, and as it curls, that will indicate to you the direction. The other thing is tearing. So if I tore this like that, I'm gonna get something pretty, it looks jaggy going that way, so let's tear this way. You see how smooth that is? So this is likely the more straight edge is, see how that just tore in half? Where this actually tears through the paper, so that's the grain. Where it can tear through the paper easily is the direction of the grain. So that's another way of trying to figure out, you know, which way your paper, the grain of your paper. And again, some papers are your grain is going to go along the short edge, like this one. Some papers, the grain is going to go along the long edge. It's not going to all be the same. And papers don't always tell you which which they are, if they are short grain or long grain. A lot of papers that are used for bookbinding and bookmaking generally will tell you. And so that is something that that you might be able to find, but not always. So why does it matter what the paper grain is? And how do you even use that information? Does it matter to you? Should it matter to you? It really depends on the type of project you're making and what kind of finish you're looking for. So mostly, I would say the only time I really care is in album making. And largely that's because I do want my mini albums to hold up. And I often will make them as gifts, and so I also want them to have a really nice finish. So these are just two squares, 80 pound, and I'll go ahead and mark the direction of the grain. So it feels like, okay, the grain is going this way. Okay. So when you're folding paper, if you want to maintain the strength of your paper, there are a couple things that are ideal. One, you want to fold with the grain. So kind of like I was showing with the pens. If you have your grains going like this, and these are kind of staggered end to end like that, if you're folding it along this, then the paper fibers stay nice and long, and so you're maintaining the strength of your paper fibers. If you fold it this way, you might put a fold here, and that's going to break some of these paper fibers, and you're going to shorten your paper fibers, which can weaken your papers or cause cracking, which wouldn't look as nicely. Then the other thing you can do to help keep the strength is to score before you put a fold onto your paper. So I'm going to score it at 1 inch, and over here on the 3 inch, I will, I'm gonna aim to fold it without putting a score line in. So if I fold this on the score line, it folds easily, it's nice and straight, it's smooth, no cracking. Every paper is going to be different, but here I've just marked 2 endpoints of where I want my fold to be. I'm not going to score it, and but I'm folding with the grain, but just not going to score it first. And so I'm being careful getting it right on the pencil marks there. And So then that's what I end up with. So this paper, well, the reason why I have this paper is because it does fold really well without cracking, but it's not as crisp of a fold as when we score it. And if I open that up, you can maybe tell. It's a little hard to tell on camera, but it's not going to be quite as smooth, not quite as sharp, but all in all, not too bad. And that was with the grain. So then what happens if we score and fold against the grain? So again, I'm going to do this gonna do one time with scoring, and then the other time I'm just gonna fold it. So again, I scored against the grain, but it still holds up okay. There's only like a little bit of cracking, but not really a ton. It's not quite as clean, so you can kind of see how there's like a little bit of cracking at the end there, but it's not that bad, and this might help. So on the right is scored, and on the left is scored with the grain, and on the left is not. That's against the grain. Very marginal, that difference. Both of them are scored. They both are still pretty crisp. To the naked eye, I can see a difference, but it's not that bad. Let's see what happens when I fold against the grain and without scoring. And again, this is one of the papers that I generally use quite often, so I know it's going to perform fairly well. But even with this, it's not really cracked, but it's kind of fractured. It's just not going to look as clean, and it is going to have a little bit of that fractured look that's not a nice sharp edge. I mean, even if you go with the grain, because you're not breaking as many paper fibers, even without scoring, it actually turned out okay. But with this, you can really tell that's, at least to the naked eye, a little hard to tell on camera. But do this test yourself with your papers, and you'll see to the naked eye how different it looks. And if I open the paper up, you can maybe see how sort of how cracked that looks versus scoring. So you can score against the grain and it would still look okay. So that's why generally, if I'm going to fold a piece of paper, I definitely want to put a score line in, and if it's just for card making and whatnot, I don't really care if I'm going with the grain or against the grain, because as long as you score the line, it's going to soften the paper fibers and it will help you to get a nice clean edge, and helps to also prevent your cardstock from cracking. So that does definitely make a difference. And for your most paper crafting, maybe that's all you really need to take away is to score anytime you want to put a fold in. But let's see, this paper, let's see if this gives us a better demonstration, because I know this one, first off, it's a color cardstock, so that has a white core, so you can see how cracked that is, and you can see some of the white core actually show through. So that's going against the grain. and just folding it without a scorer first. If I score it and fold, you can see how much more clean that is, and you don't see white. Where this one, I can do that again, where I'll aim for an inch and an inch. And I'll just try to get those right on the mark there. And then I fold it without actually scoring. You can kind of see there's some breaks because you can see some of that white come through and break. Whereas this line was scored and there isn't the white. This one I just haphazardly folded. You can see there's a lot of cracking on that one. So that's kind of the difference that scoring can make. And this was all, against the grain. So if you're gonna just fold something against the grain haphazardly, you can see how much damage that's done. So that's already breaking a lot of paper fibers. It's weakening the paper. This fold, I've softened the paper fibers. I haven't broken the paper fibers. So by scoring, not only does it look better, but I'm helping that to actually hold up better over time because I actually haven't exposed, the center core. So if this had any sort of coating on it, that coating is still going to protect the center, and as well, because we've just softened and bent those paper fibers, they're still there. They're just not cracked through. Where this one, again, you can see just by folding it like more times, more and more of the white is showing through. Where I've bent this up multiple times and you don't see any of the white core coming through. Not yet anyways, maybe it will over time. But you can see that first one and the third one where I haven't scored, more and more of that center is getting exposed as I bend this more and more. So that's why if you're making something, let's say, like a kinetic card, a fun fold card, you definitely want to score so that over time it doesn't start looking like this. It will hold up and look nice, and as well, it'll just be stronger because the more white that's being exposed, that means the more paper fibers are cracking, are bending, and it's just weakening that fold. So things like mini albums, especially when you're doing your albums that might have flips and flaps, that might have hinges for your pages and whatnot, that's when I care about really trying to maintain as much as possible the strength of that paper. And so to set myself up for success so that I'm creating something that has some good longevity to it, what I'll do is score with the grain and always score before I fold. And that way, that just kind of maximizes the strength of the paper, like holding it, retaining its strength, even despite having a fold put through it. So that's sort of the one reason why you might want to care about paper grain and about how to fold and the difference that it can make. The other thing is that when I score, I always score, and when I go to fold, I always fold. So if I put the scoring line in like that, it's created a valley. It's created a sort of a dent, a debossed line. I want to turn that valley into a mountain. So I fold it like that because we've softened all the papers along that edge. So now as it needs to bend around that fold, it's smoother. It can do that and it can stretch across that fold more easily. If you bent this the other way, it may not make as big of a difference. So it just depends, but it will actually, over time, it might make a little bit of a difference, but what you've done is you've softened this one edge but you've stretched this edge across that fold. But you can still see it didn't crack. It might start to a little bit the more I bend it, but right off the gates it didn't crack. Over time it kind of cracked on the opposite side a little bit. You could kind of see the crevice. But the way that you want to do it is so that the side that you scored, the side that you made the dent, you want to fold that as a mountain, and then on the other side you'll get that little mound of cardstock. And that's why anytime I'm making something where I have to glue something that's going right up against a score line, you just want to make sure you don't go up against that curved bit of cardstock, so that this can still fold down completely all the way. And you're not gonna get that if you fold the other way, which maybe you like the look of better, but just depending on what your project is and how long you want it to hold up, this folding this way, where you fold your deboss line as a mountain, that's gonna keep things nice and strong over time. So that's just a little bit about paper grain and folding and why it might matter. Maybe it doesn't matter for the types of projects that you're making, but so that's for you to determine. But that's kind of the reasons why I like to know about this stuff, because I do make mini albums and whatnot, and so it does help to know that. So that's all I wanted to share about paper. So just to give a recap, paper weight is measured most often for cardstock in cover weight. The US system indicates it in number of pounds, cover weight, and the metric system for everything, whether it's like printer paper or cardstock, they measure it as GSM, grams per square meter. And in the US basis system, you do have to keep in mind that 100-pound cover weight is different from 100-pound text weight or 100-pound index weight. So just, you have to look for both things. You have to look for the number of pounds and whether it's, cover or text or index or points, all the various things. So do take note of that. Then in terms of the various different types of papers that you can get, there's a infinite number of colors that papers can come in. There's different ways that they can be finished. Some can be very high gloss, some can be kind of iridescent, and some can have a more metallic look to them. There can be some papers that have different textures, like an actual like embossed design to them, or papers that just have a more natural texture. We didn't even talk about handmade papers that actually have a lot of the wood pulp and stuff showing, like mulberry papers and rice paper and various papers like that. There's papers that come super smooth, some that have that sort of a texture, like a woven texture to it. And even among your just plain old white papers, there can be papers that are super smooth and great for alcohol marker coloring. There could be some papers that have a bit more grit to it. Watercolor papers that can be hot press or cold press papers. There's papers papers that aren't even really papers, that aren't made from like a wood pulp. Those would be things like your Yupo paper and acetate and vellum and things like that. Then you have the manufacturing of or production of those papers. So some papers are dyed, like this one, and they're produced as white papers and then they're dyed. So papers like this, pattern papers, are like that. They're basically printed, white paper that's been printed. Some papers have a coating, like often glitter papers will have some kind of coating to encapsulate that paper. Some papers are very glossy and very shiny, like your mirror papers. Some papers are more matte, and like your pearlescent papers. And pattern papers come that way too. Some pattern papers are very glossy, and some are more semi-gloss, and some are matte. So you get the whole gamut of the different ways that the paper was produced, the different finishes that might have been applied to it, and the different looks that you can get as a result of that. And then finally, I talked a little bit about the grain of a piece of paper. So, how to find, which way the grain is going, why that might matter, and what happens when you fold a piece of paper, with scoring, without scoring, with the grain, against the grain, and why that might matter. How that might impact the look of it, but as well, the strength of that paper, especially over time. And so those are the topics that I covered, and again, just trying to impart the things that I've read and learned over my sort of journey as a paper crafter, and especially as I got into doing other paper crafts than just card making. So I really got into this a lot when I was learning how to stitch, do the handmade books the way that they used to be done, where you would have stacks that are folded, and you would stitch them together, and hand do some hand binding to sew all of those together. So it's really fascinating how paper is made, and especially when I started to work with Victor at High Supply, and I started to look into washi paper, which is just a whole other world, and the process for washi paper is just very, very fascinating. But that could be a whole other topic, but really, really great, and lots of fun to just kind of go down the rabbit hole learning about all of this stuff and how paper is made, and all of that. But I wanted to share that as part of my paper crafting 101 series, so that if you're getting into paper crafting, I should say, and just depending on the types of projects you think you might like to make, learning some of the things about, especially with paper green, might have more of an impact just depending on the types of projects you like to do, like albums, 3D makes, and whatnot. And maybe it's not something that's quite as important for card making. But as I mentioned here, if you're gonna make like a fun fold or an interactive card that has a fold on it, and you're working with, say, white core paper, it actually might make an impact, even if that card isn't meant to last for 10 years. It still might make a visual impact in the result of, how your finished project looks. So I hope that you found this video helpful, and if there's more things that about paper that you'd love to share with me, please do leave that in the comments below. If I got anything wrong, feel free to correct me nicely. I'm always eager to learn about different things, and I do have a companion blog post talking about all of the same things I went over in this video. So So if reading it is a better, easier way for you to consume information, then I'll leave a link to my blog post in the description box below. And I also have that table where I've got the paperweight conversion in that blog post too. So that might be a handy reference, and you can always get that from that post. Thanks again for joining me on this one, and until next time, happy crafting and have a fabulous day. Bye.